Hey guys, tonight we walk beneath weeping willows, along the worn stones of a scholar's garden, where bamboo creaks in the night air and moonlight catches the glint of ink on silk. You smell plum blossoms, faint but sharp, and somewhere just ahead, yes, there it is again, that flat-footed shuffling noise in the underbrush. You pause. Another duck. Of course it's another duck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the Tang Dynasty now, which means you're also surrounded by the most poetically overachieving people to ever stare meaningfully at a pond. You're not exaggerating. These scholars wrote verses about clouds, crickets, loneliness, exile, and especially the way plum blossoms fall just so. They were highly respected, often required to pass brutal civil service exams based on poetry. And when they weren't being bureaucrats or monks, they were out here, trying to concentrate. But here's the thing. These gardens, so carefully constructed for contemplative silence, are never silent. That rustling? That soft, snorting quack? That suspicious plop near the lotus basin? It's ducks. Always ducks. You crouch beside a shallow pond that's meant to reflect the moon like a coin in still water. But the ducks don't care about aesthetics. They're in there like it's happy hour, paddling through your poetic serenity with wet, unapologetic feet. One dun-colored little menace climbs onto the calligraphy platform someone set up by the rockery. A few ink splatters later, the draft of a poem about the fragility of youth now reads, "The duck has opinions." You hear a sigh. That's Meng Howern. He's a proper Tang poet, spent his life trying to balance enlightenment with seasonal allergies and impossible deadlines. Right now, he's holding a brush, staring into the bamboo shadows, and waiting for the right word to arrive. He's trying to write something profound about the transience of spring, but instead, his eyes keep drifting to that ridiculous duck wiggling its tail feathers beside a moss-covered stone. You think he's going to shoo it away, but no. Instead, he quietly adjusts the last line of his poem. Something about stillness broken by gentle ripples of absurdity. You squint. He's just turned the duck into a metaphor for impermanence. And yes, it works. Somehow, it works better than the original version. You're beginning to understand the problem. Historians still argue whether ducks were deliberately included in garden designs of the Tang elite or just very determined freeloaders who snuck in through irrigation channels. Either way, they became impossible to ignore. Ducks were loud. Ducks were nosy. Ducks loved human snacks. They especially loved crumbs from ceremonial tea cakes, so they learned to show up at precisely the wrong time. The famed poet Wang Wei, who was also a skilled painter and Buddhist meditator, once said that he found true peace in nature. But he also wrote a short, weirdly passive-aggressive note in the corner of one of his paintings. Lotus in bloom, disturbed by paddling. That was probably a duck. Or a metaphor. Maybe both. You slip deeper into the garden, where a group of scholars debates whether the sound of a duck flapping its wings counts as sheng, the philosophical resonant tone of nature. One insists yes. He says it's like the cough of the universe. Another says no. It's more like a wet fart in a symphony. They go on like this for hours. Here's your mainstream fact. During the Tang Dynasty, Poets were often employed by the state and required to write on command for everything from birthdays to military victories to the emperor's lunch menu. Poetry wasn't just art, it was currency. Resume survival. A single well-placed poem could earn you a government position or get you exiled, depending on your tone and your metaphor. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some poets actually carried tiny birds with them. Nightingales, finches, once even a talking mynah, to help inspire them or entertain guests with spontaneous recitations. But you know who showed up without an invitation? Ducks, always ducks. You kneel beside a half-dry fountain, carved like a dragon's head. Water drips in slow rhythm. A poet nearby mutters the beginnings of a verse. Time flows as... But before he can finish, a nearby duck lets out a honk that sounds suspiciously like a burp. The poet winces. He dips his brush, rewrites, starts again. It's not just a distraction, it's interference. These ducks seem to know they're ruining the moment. But are they? That's the question that starts to haunt you. Maybe, just maybe, ducks were the final test. A natural filter for true poetic enlightenment. If you can keep your mind still while a wet duck chews your sleeve, maybe you deserve to be published. You reach a tiny pavilion draped with vines, where someone has fallen asleep beside a scroll, face down in spilled ink. A duck is standing triumphantly on his back, eyes closed, making a soft grinding noise like a feathered machine. You stare. The duck opens one eye, looks at you, then waddles down and slaps the scroll with one webbed foot. The new poem now includes the line, "Dreams disturbed by waddled fate." You've stopped being surprised. You stretch out beneath a flowering tree, where the scent of osmanthus clings to the humid air. Crickets are chirping. Somewhere nearby, a poet is softly reciting verses into the night. You can hear the cadence, the gentle rhythm. And then, yes, just before the last couplet lands, a duck honks. Perfect timing. You close your eyes. You're starting to get it. You wake to the smell of roasted chestnuts and oolong steam curling from a lacquered teapot. The garden hasn't changed much, still the mossy paths, still the embroidered breeze slipping through cedar boughs, but the poets have moved indoors. You follow the soft clack of ceramic cups and the rustle of silk sleeves to a small tea pavilion, where everyone's trying very hard to look contemplative. But the moment you step in, you catch sight of them. 3 ducks, perfectly aligned, staring dead ahead like they're waiting to be served. No one acknowledges them. You sit beside a low table, across from a scholar furrowing his brow over a brushstroke. The line he's working on is meant to capture the breath of morning fog across a distant mountain. But his rhythm keeps tripping. It's not the tea, it's not the ink. It's the ducks pacing behind him like they're judging his meter. He mutters, "They always show up during the second line." You nod, unsure if you're supposed to laugh. Here's your mainstream fact for this stretch of the journey. Tang poetry, especially Juju, those tight 4-line masterpieces, relied not just on vivid imagery, but precise tonal patterns and couplet symmetry. The rules were rigid. The emotion was not. One wrong syllable, one misplaced image, and the whole thing fell apart like soggy rice paper. Now imagine trying to perfect that delicate balance while a duck is chewing on your sandal. A young student nearby is panicking over a failed verse. He reads aloud, "Rain taps the leaves," a distant cry, but can't finish. The duck honks. Everyone freezes. The timing is suspiciously good. The student looks up like he's just received divine intervention. He adds, quacks once and disappears. Applause, laughter. The duck looks smug. You hate that you're impressed. Tea culture in the Tang Dynasty wasn't just about flavor. It was an aesthetic, a philosophy, even a poetic exercise. There were treatises on the correct angle for pouring, the ideal temperature for steeping, the optimal moment to sip in silence. But silence, again, wasn't easily kept. Ducks loved the smell of tea, especially the sweet floral blends. They'd march right up to the table, dip their beaks in someone's prized cup, then shuffle off with a trail of wet footprints. And yet, nobody throws them out. You sip from your own cup, careful not to disturb the scroll beside you. The verse scrawled there reads, "A single feather floats / teacup trembles at its fall." You pause. Did the poet write that because a duck shed a feather into his drink? Almost certainly. Does it work poetically? Also yes. There's an open scholarly debate around whether poets intentionally allowed interruptions like these to enhance their spontaneity, or simply gave up fighting the inevitable. After all, Tang poetry prized not just precision, but immediacy. A line scribbled in reaction to a passing moment could hold more truth than 100 planned stanzas. So perhaps, as some have argued, the ducks were not distractions. They were fate with feathers. You lean back and listen to the conversation drifting through the pavilion. The elder poet is explaining that ducks, in certain regional folklore, are considered messengers between the mundane and the absurd. He tells a story about a monk who meditated under a waterfall for 20 years only to break his silence when a duck slapped him with its wing. He reportedly said, "That's enough." The group laughs gently. Someone pours more tea. The steam rises in delicate coils, twisting like thoughts you forgot to finish. At the edge of the room, another poet is sketching, trying to catch the curve of a duck mid-waddle. He explains, almost apologetically, that it helps him understand movement for his metaphors. You glance at the page. The duck is not flattered. It looks like a particularly smug onion. Outside, the light shifts. A breeze stirs the reeds around the garden pond. One of the ducks waddles to the threshold of the tea room, looks out solemnly, and then very deliberately lets out a honk that echoes just once through the columns. You feel like you've been dismissed. You rise, wandering past the now half-dozing group. Their calligraphy brushes lie sideways on scrolls. One poet is asleep with his head on the table. Another is muttering dream poetry. A duck rests beside them, one eye open, as if guarding a secret line that's not yet ready to be written. There's a long, meandering corridor leading away from the tea house. You follow it, stepping over tiny cracks where moss has begun to grow. The floorboards creak like reluctant editors. Halfway down, you find another poet sitting cross-legged in a quiet alcove. No tea here, just ink, wind, and silence. He looks up at you and says, "The ducks remind me of my brother." You nod because there's nothing else to say. And then he adds, uninvited, noisy, and somehow always right. This is your quirky tidbit for the hour. There's a preserved Tang era letter in which a poet tries to explain to his friend why a visiting nobleman's poetry sounds forced. His reason? Too much moon, not enough duck. You sit beside him, listening as he composes a verse not about longing, or death, or exile, but about a duck stealing a peach bun and refusing to apologize. It is, against all odds, beautiful. The sky dims slightly, turning the pond's surface into a pewter mirror. One of the ducks glides across it, like an emperor on a barge. You feel, absurdly, like bowing. The poet beside you sighs. "I've written 50 verses about plum blossoms," he says, "but not one of them feels as honest as when I just described the duck biting me during line 3. The ink brush moves, the line flows, and you realize maybe the duck isn't the problem. Maybe it's the point. You step through a moon gate and into the hush of an imperial garden, vast and too perfect to be real. Pavilions shimmer on the lake's edge like floating scrolls. Lily bloom in curated clusters. Everything is arranged for maximum elegance, which of course means it's absolutely crawling with ducks. You spot them immediately. On the marble steps, by the lacquered boats, waddling beneath peony hedges with the unshakable confidence of creatures who have never once paid taxes. Welcome to court. Here, poets don't write because they want to. They write because the emperor says, "Compose a verse about the clarity of my reign, and do it before lunch." The stakes are higher, the metaphors more political, and the interruptions somehow even louder. There's one now a piercing quunk, just as a nervous court poet bows to recite his ode to national harmony. Everyone freezes. The duck has spoken. The emperor squints. The poet starts over, this time replacing the word tranquil with resilient, which seems to please both ruler and bird. The poet survives another day. Here's your mainstream fact. The Tang emperors were deeply invested in poetry. Some, like Emperor Xuanzong, were poets themselves. They curated poetic circles, sponsored competitions, and expected courtiers to respond to events, seasons, and even dreams with verse. Poetry wasn't a hobby. It was a public performance of intellect and loyalty. So imagine trying to express the subtle melancholy of early autumn, while a duck repeatedly attempts to climb into the lap of a general. And yet, these ducks are not unwelcome. In fact, they're suspiciously tolerated. Maybe even coordinated? You join a procession moving toward the water's edge. The emperor wants to hear seasonal compositions read aloud while drifting on the lake. The palace musicians strike up a gentle tune on flutes and lutes, and low-ranking poets clamber into ornate boats, their faces pale with panic. You board one yourself, sitting beside a scholar with extremely bad luck. A duck has decided he's its soulmate and is currently nesting in his lap. The boat drifts. A poet begins his recitation. Petals descend, / my loyalty rises. A golden breeze. Quack. The duck interrupts. The breeze is real, but so is the guano now decorating his sleeve. He hesitates, pauses, adjusts. A breeze that blesses even the fowl. The emperor chuckles. The court laughs. The poet wipes his arm with silent horror. Historians still argue whether the presence of ducks in these settings was part of a broader philosophical joke or simply an accident of palace ecology. On one hand, the palace gardens were designed to replicate idealized nature, a place where all creatures harmonize under heaven's mandate. On the other hand, ducks are chaos in a bow tie. You overhear one advisor mutter that ducks are auspicious symbols of fertility and devotion, which may be true, but doesn't explain why they keep stealing fish from the koi pond, or why they seem to know the exact moment when a poem is about to get too self-important. Here's your quirky tidbit. During one New Year's poetry contest in Chang'an, a famously pompous court poet compared the emperor to a radiant phoenix that calms the world. Just as he finished, a duck squawked so violently it fell backward into a brazier. It survived. So did the poet. But the emperor reportedly laughed so hard, he ordered the duck to be given honorary garden residency. You're beginning to wonder if the ducks are part of some imperial balancing act, a way to keep egos in check. Nothing humbles like writing 5 stanzas on celestial harmony, only to have your last line drowned out by a bill-slapping splash. You recline in your boat, listening to the sounds of paddle against water, flute against breeze, duck against dignity. The lake stretches silver beneath the sky. Lanterns bob gently beside drifting lotuses. A new poet steps forward, trembling slightly. His topic, renewal in the face of adversity. His voice is soft but steady. Though frost may bend the stem, it breaks not the root. The ducks fall silent, just for a breath. You all listen. Then one lets out a low, approving honk. The poet bows. No one dares clap, but a court lady whispers, they approve. And just like that, the ducks are no longer just interruptions. They're critics, possibly divine ones. There's an open scholarly debate about whether ducks, being both domesticated and wild-spirited, embodied a symbolic threshold for Tang poets, creatures that belonged everywhere and nowhere. Too clever to be dismissed, too ridiculous to be praised outright, and always walking straight into the most delicate moments. It's said that the great Li Bai, drunk on wine and moonlight, once declared to an entire banquet, ducks understand more about poetry than half of you. He was probably exaggerating. Probably, but maybe not. The boats return to shore. The musicians pack up. The emperor retires behind beaded curtains. But the ducks stay, trailing after the departing scholars like short, flappy reminders that enlightenment rarely comes in silence. It comes sometimes with wet feet and a sideways stare. As you step back onto land, you find a small slip of paper stuck to your sandal. It's a discarded couplet, likely from someone's failed draft. You read it under your breath. They walk through palaces without permission / yet never leave empty-clawed. You smile. It's not wrong. You leave the imperial gardens behind, trading gold-tipped pavilions for winding forest paths. The air cools. The light softens. Your feet crunch over pine needles as you climb toward a mountain retreat, where monks and poets vanish into mist in search of wisdom, tea, and inevitably ducks. The Hermitage is simple. Bamboo walls, wind chimes, a trickling stream that's probably more symbolic than practical. You pass a stone tablet etched with something poetic about the void, though a recent scratch beneath it adds. And also the duck. Here, among mossy rocks and whispering leaves, you expect peace. What you find is a robed figure standing knee-deep in a pond, waving his arms at a duck that has stolen his only brush. Welcome to the Taoist way. Your mainstream fact tonight. Many Tang poets were deeply influenced by Taoism, a philosophy that emphasized natural spontaneity, detachment, and aligning oneself with the rhythms of the universe. Retreating into nature was not just a vacation, it was spiritual calibration. You were supposed to dissolve into the world like ink into water. And yet, every time someone tries to dissolve into anything around here, a duck shows up with the energy of a child banging pots during a meditation session. You watch as the frustrated monk finally gives up and sits cross-legged in the stream. The duck waddles onto the bank, brush still clutched in its beak, and promptly drops it into a puddle. The monk sighs, then laughs, then says, "So be it. You understand. This is the Tao now." Poets who came to these retreats often sought silence, absolute quiet, to hear the voice of the cosmos, or at least to hear themselves think. But ducks don't honor existential schedules. They show up at sunrise, honk through mantras, steal fruit meant for offerings, and sometimes paddle in tight, contemplative circles that look suspiciously deliberate. There's an open scholarly debate about whether ducks, due to their connection to water and flight, represented a kind of between-world presence creatures, both mundane and mystical. Taoist texts are famously open to animal symbolism, especially when it comes uninvited and wearing a look of smug detachment. You settle by a creek where a poet is quietly composing something about the echo of wind through cedar. He dips his brush in ink, raises it, and freezes. There's a duck staring at him from across the bank, not moving, just watching. After a full minute, the poet nods slowly and changes his line from wind forgets its path to wind stumbles over webbed feet. It's better. It's weirder, but it's better. A gentle rain begins to fall. Mist curls through the trees, wrapping the Hermitage in a softness that makes everything feel ancient and new at once. You watch another poet, this one older, with trembling hands scatter crumbs on a stone ledge. Ducks gather, silently, as if they've been waiting all day for this particular ritual. The old poet speaks. They're reminders that you are not the center of the universe, that something ridiculous is always near. This is your quirky tidbit. Several preserved poems from mountain monasteries include lines that modern translators have marked with question marks because they reference things like the honking of enlightenment or the waddling of fate. We now suspect these were literal ducks, but at the time, maybe they weren't. You walk deeper into the woods and come across a shrine built from river stones. Tucked beneath it is a single poem on worn parchment, likely an offering to a mountain spirit. It reads, "Ask not the sage nor the stream / ask the duck that bites your sandal. It knows the way and will not share." You close your eyes and listen. Somewhere in the trees, a duck honks with perfect echo. It sounds like laughter. It also sounds like a warning. Poets here tell stories of ducks leading them to unexpected places, a waterfall, a hidden grove, a moment of stillness they hadn't earned. Others say the ducks showed them only one thing, that the mind, no matter how disciplined, can still be undone by a flapping wing and a wet footprint on parchment. And maybe that's the lesson. There's one final retreat high above the clouds, where wind shivers through narrow ridges and stars appear closer than Earth. You climb slowly, breathing pine-scented air, feeling the altitude turn your thoughts into jelly. At the summit, a hut made of crooked beams and too many prayers. Inside, a single scroll reads, "All truths must pass the duck test. If quacked at, and they fall, then let them fall." You sit on the threshold, feet dangling over the void. Below you, mist swirls like forgotten dreams. And just beside you, pecking at a loose thread on your sleeve, is a duck, silent, present, annoying, perfect. You don't swat it away. You don't move. You just sit, letting the duck chew your robe while the wind writes its own verse across your face. You think, this is the closest I've been to understanding anything. And then the duck bites you. Not hard, but firmly. As if to say, don't get cocky. You're in a town now, if you can call it that. Really, it's a sprawling blur of lanterns, sake pots, and poetry contests that no one will remember in the morning. It's the edge of civilization, the part of the Tang world where things get fuzzy and rules get suggested. You follow the trail of slurred couplets and spilled rice wine to a moonlit tavern perched above a river. Laughter spills from its doors. So do several poets. One is reciting something tearful about starlight, while another throws up into a bush. This is the glamorous life of poetic greatness. And the ducks are here too. Of course they are. One is perched on the bar, like it owns the place, pecking at peanuts. Another waddles across the table, where two poets argue over whether sorrow or yearning makes better verse. A third duck just stole a rice dumpling and is currently being chased by a man waving a fan and shouting, "Come back with my symbolism." Here's your mainstream fact. The Tang Dynasty's poetic culture wasn't confined to courtly pavilions and mountain retreats. Many of its greatest verses were composed in taverns, brothels, roadside inns, places where emotions were raw, inhibitions low, and inspiration soaked in wine. Li Bai, the most legendary of them all, famously wrote masterpieces while completely blitzed. He also reportedly tried to embrace the moon's reflection in a lake and drowned. And the ducks? Oh, they thrived here. Because where there was wine, there were snacks. And where there were snacks, there were ducks performing tiny crimes of opportunity. You take a seat beside a table already overcrowded with scrolls, spilled ink, and one duck nesting in a poet's sleeve. The poet doesn't seem to notice. He's mid-rant about how the full moon reminds him of lost love, broken time, and the dumpling he just dropped. You look at the duck. It's chewing that dumpling with zero remorse. The poet sighs and grins. She always hated ducks, he says, then begins writing a new poem about her, but this time with a punchline. You're noticing a pattern. There's an open scholarly debate about whether these tavern ducks were truly wild or half domesticated by accident. Some claim that poets started naming them. One drunk diary entry refers to Old Wang the duck, who reportedly attended 3 consecutive poetry nights and once sat in the judge's lap. You believe it. The barkeep rings a small bell. Next round the theme is regret. A young poet stands, swaying. He shouts, "My shoes were lost, my purse was light," then pauses, noticing a duck drinking from his bowl. He adds, "And the duck drank better than I did?" Thunderous applause. Someone lights a paper lantern and lets it float. Others follow. The sky fills with glowing syllables and wine-fueled ambition. It's beautiful in that way drunken beauty always is. Fleeting, unsteady, more real than reality. And through it all, the ducks wander. Somewhere in the back of the tavern, an argument breaks out. 2 poets, both slightly too confident, both convinced they've invented the perfect closing line to a love poem. They decide to settle it the traditional way, with a duck test. You follow them outside to the riverbank, where one of them writes his final couplet on a slip of parchment and sets it afloat on a paper boat. If the duck chooses his, he wins. The other does the same. 2 boats, 2 poems, 1 duck. The duck waddles toward the water, eyes narrowed with the weight of responsibility. Everyone falls silent. It pauses, sniffs both boats, then turns and waddles away, honking in disgust. Nobody wins. Everyone cheers anyway. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some wandering poets believe ducks could sense dishonesty in verse. One wrote that if your heart isn't in the ink, the duck will not read. There is no historical proof of duck-based literary criticism, but you're beginning to suspect there should be. You retreat to the river's edge, watching the lanterns float like sleepy fireflies. Someone nearby strums a lute. A pair of poets are reciting each other's worst poems for laughs. The duck who judged the contest is now sitting on someone's hat. It's getting late. A man sits beside you. His beard is too long, his eyes too bright. I once tried to write a poem without mentioning ducks, he says. Took me 6 months. Got published. Then a duck pooped on the manuscript. You stare at him. He nods solemnly. Coincidence? He asks. Maybe, you say. Exactly, he whispers, and disappears into the shadows like a particularly poetic raccoon. Someone nearby spills ink. Someone else spills wine. The duck spills itself across a bench and falls asleep, head tucked beneath wing. You find that you're doing the same head heavy, thoughts slow, the edge of sleep curling like calligraphy brushstrokes in your mind. Before you drift off, you hear one last voice mumble. They don't distract us. They remind us not to take ourselves too seriously. You smiled into your sleeve. It's probably true. You wake slowly, lulled by the soft lap of water against wood and the rhythmic creak of an old dock shifting in the wind. There's no tavern now, no court, no scrolls or scattered ink, just a quiet lake at the far edge of everything. The moon hangs low, blurring into the mist, and reeds sway with a hush that almost feels like breath. You sit on a warped bench at the water's edge. The world feels older here, faded almost, like everything's been written already, and now it's just rereading itself. A duck floats past, alone. You watch it paddle in slow, deliberate circles. It doesn't honk, doesn't flap, just glides as if it's thinking, as if it's waiting for you to admit something. This is where the old poets go, not just in age, but in mood. When the ambition burns down to embers and the ink dries slower than the thoughts form. They don't write to impress anymore. They write to remember or to forget. The lines grow stranger, the metaphors messier, but somehow truer. One sits not far from you now. His beard is long and stained with tea, his robes patched and repatched. He's writing on the back of an old receipt. His poem includes the line, "The duck knows I'm lying again." You nod. You understand. Here's your mainstream fact. The later years of many Tang poets were marked by exile, poverty, or quiet self-banishment. Fame, especially poetic fame, was fleeting. Dynasties shifted. Politics soured. But even in decline, many wrote their best work introspective, strange, and often filled with references to birds, rivers, and laughter that sounded suspiciously like despair. And of course, ducks. You see another now, perched atop a rock that juts into the lake like a punctuation mark. It ruffles its feathers, gazes into the fog, and lets out a sound that's less quack and more like a tired shrug. There's an open scholarly debate about whether these final poems quiet, animal-filled, meandering were meant as satire, surrender, or secret brilliance. Some scholars argue they're coded critiques of courtly hypocrisy. Others say they're just what happens when you get old and tired and stop pretending to be profound. You suspect they're both right and wrong, and not even close. The poet beside you sets down his brush and looks out at the water. I used to think I was a genius, he says, but the ducks outlived 5 of us. You glance at the duck. It blinks. There's a silence now that doesn't feel empty. It feels full. Like everything unsaid is finally okay with staying that way. Here's your quirky tidbit. One obscure anthology from the late Tang period includes a section titled Poems Composed in the Presence of Ducks. Most are anonymous. One is signed simply "Not the Duck," sadly. Another includes this unforgettable couplet. I wrote of love, she read of clouds, the duck just stole the inkstone. It's perfect. The mist thickens, the lake dissolves into whiteness, but the ducks remain, still floating, still watching. They were never the joke, or maybe they always were, but either way, they endured. And somewhere in that ridiculous persistence, waddling through gardens, flapping through tea houses, stealing dumplings from the enlightened, there's something that keeps calling to you. Not wisdom, not meaning, just presence. You're not sure when you begin writing, but the brush moves easily. The words don't try so hard. You let them land softly, like feathers, knowing that if a duck smudges them later, it won't be the end of the world. It might even be an improvement. One last poet joins you at the lake's edge. You don't ask his name. He doesn't offer it. But he leaves behind a folded poem weighted by a smooth stone. You read it after he's gone. The duck outwaits the storm, / the poet outacts himself. Both go home hungry. You smile. There are no contests here, no emperors, no rules. Just the soft sound of water, a feather drifting past your foot, the sense that maybe, just maybe, the ducks were writing their own poems all along. Only they didn't need ink, just ripples and patience. You watch the last of them disappear into the fog. The world feels quieter now. You close your eyes. You let it all go. The bench beneath you feels like it's floating now. Or maybe it's the lake that has risen to meet your thoughts. Either way, the night grows thicker, the air warmer, the silence rounder. You sink into it, a slow drift downward, not falling but softening. Somewhere, faintly, a duck calls once more, not to summon, not to mock, just to remind you that it's still there, still gliding, still part of this strange, stubborn world. Your breath slows. The old poems, the courtly whispers, the drunken laughter, they all blur now, edges folding into one another like the corners of a dream. You remember the stone steps of the garden, the quiet slap of feet on tile, the moment the scroll fell into the pond and you laughed instead of panicking. That might have been your best moment. There's something about ducks, isn't there? The way they interrupt without apologizing. The way they demand nothing and yet leave everything slightly different. They were never distractions. They were punctuation. And now, as your thoughts settle into still water, and your body lets go of the day like an old line you don't need anymore, you carry only this. A ripple. A laugh. A line that doesn't quite rhyme. A feather falling slowly through fog. Sleep now. The ducks are watching the lake.